There was always a budding underground in hip hop. Everything just doesn't fit mainstream. Some things just aren't meant to, or it's not meant to hit mainstream right when it does hit mainstream. Um, there was always guys coming up on the scene in California and stuff like that, especially Oakland, independently. And Oakland's another city that's a nice blueprint for independent hip hop. But when you talk about on a level of, by the time they came out to Houston to start giving out deals, everybody was driving Ferraris. Everybody had nice houses. Everybody had built-in fan bases. All this stuff because they had built a system. I think that's crazy that instead of begging, national booking agents and stuff like that to book you for pennies, you can build yourself up in your own region and just perform in that region for the people that love you, and do that over and over again. These guys from Houston were going from, traveling out to like the small cities in Texas and in Dallas and then like Louisiana and just that area, Amarillo. They were doing all that stuff just in that area and making fortunes. Selling their CDs, selling 100,000 mixtapes at $8 a copy. You do the math on that. 100,000 CDs at $8 a copy. That's not what everybody was doing. That's just some of the stories that you hear. And I was down there in the late 2000s going into 2010s, and I seen the mixtape hustle for my own eyes. And I know 10 years before that it was even more turned up because Napster and all that still hadn't kicked in yet. These guys were building fortunes independently, and it wasn't just one or two guys like in a lot of other cities. It was quite a bit of guys who were turning up, doing their thing, and even if they weren't famous in the city, they were still building a name. Without the industry having to call you out or big up you. By the time they came in 2005, they were having to negotiate the hell out of these contracts with these guys because these guys are like, man, I've already made what you're offering me. I'm not desperate. These guys were not making their deals in desperation because a lot of them already had it. You talk about the Slim Thugs. You talk about, Kiki and, all these different guys, Paul Wall and Mike Jones. That was the second generation. The first generation had been out there 10 years by the time the majors came out. They had already been out there 10 to 15 years before that, building that sound up. Screw had people coming and buying his screw tapes by the thousands, built around around the block, waiting to buy tapes. Like this is a mid-major city in America. Well, Houston's pretty big, but for it not to be like LA or New York or Miami or something like that, like all this was going on inside one city, and they ended up influencing everybody because they were so much on what they were doing that you had to pay attention. Before that, still, before places like Houston, and yeah, LA had its own sound, and Oakland and stuff like that, but a lot of people were just trying to mimic New York. And then a lot of people were just mimicking New York and LA. But once places like Houston came out, where they started slowing down the music and rapping at a slow pace, and talking with their own slang and stuff like that, they brought something completely new to the game. They brought something completely new and fresh to the game. They were talking in a way people weren't talking. E40 was making up all kinds of slang in the 90s, that hip hoppers was running off with. But you go down there to Houston, man, they talk completely their own way. They ride their cars their own way. Everything was a vibe out there. Take note of that when you're talking about them being a blueprint. They built their own system. While other cities are mimicking what they see when Rap City comes on and BET and all that and MTV, they're like, forget that. This is what we do out here. This is something different. And that's what made Houston so attractive as far as what they had going. You got to build a system. You got to network no matter how you feel. People have this idea that, these guys just all loved each other and stuff like that. That's one thing, Southern hospitality. Nah, it was just as competitive there. It was a lot of guys who didn't like each other. But at the same time, they understood the bigger picture. They had OGs that they were listening to, giving them the bigger picture that, we can get the bread if we're together, get all the personal stuff out the way, how you feel about this guy and stuff like that, and get to the bag. And, Houston eventually got its time to shine, and it wasn't very long and stuff like that, but, the influence forever impacted the South. And you got to look closely at what they did to, get things to where they are now. When you hear the tempo of songs, when you hear how a lot of songs still have that, screwed, thing in the hook and all this different stuff. And even there, man, it's crazy how it's not a hit in Houston if you're not sampling another rapper's raps from Houston in your hook. That's how much on their own, tip they are out there. They got their own sound on just everything. They built a system that could feed everybody. Instead of building little small systems, everybody building their own little small systems that can feed a couple people. They were building a system that can have everybody fed, have everybody doing shows around the region, have everybody's CDs getting listened to, everybody going through the same distributor. They built a beautiful system. And the game is going back independent. So places like Houston are probably you're going to hear about them again. They're probably going to run it up again because the way the game is being forced to go, they've already been moving that way for 30 years. They've already been moving that way for 30 years. You know what I'm saying? Study if you're into hip hop like that, and you want to do the thing on an independent level, and you want your city to be getting known and things like that, get popping. Study what Houston did between the late 80s and going into 2010s and beyond, especially the 90s going into the 2000s and 2010s. Like that era from like 90, I want to say 4 to like 06, when they was really, really, really putting it down. Study that. Study how by the time they got hot in 06, 05, 04, stuff like that, with Slim Thug and Mike Jones and all them still tipping. Study the things they did to get there, man. It was so much done to get there. And wow, it's just crazy, man. I'm a huge fan of Houston hip hop because, again, I know it's the blueprint for independent hip hop, and with a dying music industry, man, everybody needs to be paying attention to what those guys did to get where they needed to go. And a lot of those guys are still eating off their Cadillacs, eating off their catalogs, and doing shows even in the old age because they follow the system. If you want your city to work, you got to follow a system, man. You got to build a system, create a system that's to you guys' taste, shape the game to your fit.